I'm going to start doing a timeline for the rest of my lecture. Let's call this ground zero, okay? This is the death of Jesus. We're going to be working that way. This is ground zero. What year is it? Usually 30 AD, pretty popular. Second most popular date, 33. All right. Now, if you ask the average person, you say, Paul writes 1 Corinthians about here, 25 years away. How do you know that's reliable material in 1 Corinthians 15? Here's the old method. This is not the minimal facts argument. The old method, which I think also works, you have to be careful, but it works. Here's the way a lot of Christians would argue. Well, let's go to Mark, and I'll use critical dates, okay? I'll use critically ascertained dates. So they'll say, you want to know what happened back there? Let's check Mark out at just 70 AD, so we're plus 40, right? Plus 40. Matthew, 80 AD, or plus 50. Luke, 85 AD, or plus 55. And everybody puts John at about 95, or plus 65. And the argument is, you know, in spite of what you might hear, these are reliably early texts in terms of distance. They have major sources from plus 40, plus 50, plus 55, and plus 60 to 65 at 90 to 95 AD. And this is great in the ancient world. You go, really? I don't do ancient history, I don't know, but is that really good? Because you hear a lot of skeptics say, well, that's way too late afterwards. Okay, let's do some comparisons. This guy's an atheist. He says, Christians are going to want to tell you that 40 to 60 years later is plenty close. I want to tell you it's not. That's really, really late. I said, do we know a lot about Alexander the Great? He said, yeah, we know a lot about Alexander the Great. Here's Alexander's death, about 330 BC. By the way, he was a private tutor. He was privately tutored by Aristotle. So, about 330 BC, our earliest source for Alexander on this timeline, our earliest source for Alexander. Now, I told Art I wouldn't go off the platform here. I have to go out that exit door. Earliest source for Alexander, plus 300. Oh yeah, yeah, we knew a lot about Alexander 300 years later. Well, they had earlier sources. That's what the argument is. Well, so did the gospel writers. Best sources for Alexander, Plutarch and Arian. They wrote 425 to 450 after Alexander died. Well, that's not. All right, pick a different example. He's an odd one, so we don't have good historical sources. All right, how about Tiberius Caesar? He was on the throne in Rome when Jesus died. Tiberius lives, he dies just a few years after Jesus does. I think 37 AD. So he's on the throne. Certain early writers link Jesus to Pilate and Tiberius. All right, and we have about the same number of major sources for Tiberius that we do for Jesus. Okay? Good comparison. Let's compare the Gospels to Tiberius real fast. What's our earliest source for Tiberius? Contemporary. And we have it. Ooh. You think to yourself, I'm not going to say anything, but the New Testament's not looking so good here because we don't have a contemporary argument, a contemporary source. There is an early source for Tiberius, a general, a Roman general, but it's the least usable of the four sources. It's the least valuable of the four sources. The next best source for Tiberius, next best source. I mean, the next source, period. It's the best one. Next source, out there. Tacitus at plus 80. 15 years later than John. Next best source, Suetonius, Roman historian, plus 85. And the fourth source for Tiberius, Dio Cassius, plus 180. Yeah, but skeptics say, yeah, but you can't compare Gospels, prejudiced religious writings, to Greco-Roman histories. Really? That's something else that's changed in recent scholarship. About 1990, a prominent classical scholar at the University of London wrote a book comparing the Gospels to Greco-Roman biographies, or bio, as it's sometimes pronounced. And he argued the Gospels have all the earmarks of Greco-Roman biographies, and they should be considered biographies. It's, maybe you can think in your own fields about how a major work has changed thought, and that has held the day since 1990. And today, most New Testament scholars, critical New Testament scholars, believe that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies. So they are the same genre. Well, then you go, yeah, but they got miracles in them. So do all the Greco-Roman historians. Oh, you're kidding. No, they do. Virtually every Greco-Roman writer. Now, Thucydides is an exception. He says he doesn't believe in that stuff and he doesn't do it. But I mean, Herodotus, the so-called father of history. Tacitus, although he has fewer than Suetonius. Suetonius has a lot. Pretty normal. You go, well, then they're all whatever. Okay, really? They're all junk because they report miracles, right? We were talking back there before this started, and let me refer to you a 2-volume work that's just come out a year ago. It's called Miracles. It's by Craig Keener, PhD from Duke, New Testament, minor in classics. So he's a Greco-Roman scholar, and he's done a 2-volume work, 1,200 pages, part 1 and part 2, on contemporary miracle claims. He's got pre and post CAT scans, pre and post MRIs, pre and post X-rays, and some of these things, when you read them, you're going to say, how come I've never heard this? I don't know, but you can't put these things down. These 2 books are just incredible. He's got hundreds of cases from all over the world. He's got so many of them that the table of contents reads like this. Cases in Asia, cases in Central America, cases in South America, cases in Western Europe, cases in North America. That's how they're arranged. And then under each section, he's got little things like those with corroboration, those with heavy evidence. And his main argument in 2 volumes is this: don't call the New Testament naive because it records miracles. And don't call Greco-Roman writers, which is his second area, don't call Greco-Roman writers naive because they record miracles. Everybody in the world knows about these things except the Western university community, and they're coming around. That's his claim. So that does not make these guys naive. Because if you're going to call John naive, you call Herodotus naive. If you call Mark naive, you call Tacitus naive. What makes Bart Ehrman say that we can get Paul's report from just plus 25? What makes Bart Ehrman say that we've got plenty of material from 1 to 2 years after the cross? How in the world can a guy who is, quote, an agnostic leaning toward atheism, how can he say we can get this material back to plus 1 or plus 2? All right, again, let's do the math. Here's the cross. When does Paul come to the Lord? Plus 2. You say, well, I think it's plus 3. Great, plus 3. 3 years later, he goes up to Jerusalem. 3 plus 3, 6, 30 AD. Oh, I think he was converted 32 AD. Okay, great. 2 plus 3, 35. And in Galatians chapter 1, Paul says, I went up to Jerusalem after 3 years, so we're plus 5 or plus 6 after the cross. And Paul says, I spent 15 days with Peter, the head apostle. He said, I saw no other apostles except James, the brother of Jesus. I spent 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Now, what were they discussing during that time? Well, the theme of the short book called Galatians is the nature of the gospel. It's, I guess maybe we could say this is the theme of Galatians. Here's the gospel. Get it right. Don't change it. If you change it, you're anathema. Preach the right thing. Don't try to get there some other way. It's by grace through faith. All right, you got it? Don't mess up the gospel. That's the bottom line. So when he goes to Jerusalem at +5 or +6, if they weren't talking about the gospel centrally, at least had to come up. Now, you know, as a guy who studied the resurrection all my life, and I tell people the resurrection rescued me from 10 years of skepticism. I told my mother from back in those days that I was this close to becoming a Buddhist. I really was. And in fact, some days I think I was, like we were talking about in the car, you know, what side of the fence am I on? I don't know. You know, you're in grad school and you're going through this stuff and a lot of things are going on. And the resurrection kind of rescued me from this. I could see that this argument wins the day. Seriously. All right, so what's going on here? I know what I would ask Peter and James first. This would be my first question to them if I'm the Apostle Paul. I'll tell you what I saw on the way to Damascus if you tell me what you saw a few days after the crucifixion. How did he look? Come on, guys. Give it to me. What did you guys see? Then I'll tell you what I saw. And then I might say this if I'm Paul, depending on how bold Paul is. And, you know, Paul was pretty bold from his epistles. I might have said this. Hey, guys, the three of us have something in common here. I'm not trying to dog you guys, but you know, we all have a point in our life when we weren't exactly exemplary followers of the Lord. I was on my way to kill or imprison men, women, and children who named the name of Christ. I'm not proud of that. James, you grew up in the house with the Messiah, and you were an unbeliever. Somebody told me you used to think your brother was insane. That's what Mark 3 says. That his family thought he was beside himself. And James might have hung his head and say, I didn't know any better. Peter, you have an exalted position as a head apostle. I'm not trying to dog you, but you denied your Lord 3 times. Now, if I'm writing a book here, I'm going to put an informational footnote. I'm going to say a pastoral note. I'm going to say, look what God does with people who've made a lot of mistakes, and he uses them later. That's hysteresi. And Paul says, I went back here at +5 or 6 because I wanted to investigate. Then, as we go from the end of Galatians 1 to Galatians 2, no chapter break, he says, 14 years later, I went back. All right. 14 years later, I went back. Critics, Bart Ehrman, Helmut Kirster at Harvard, they put this event at about 48 AD. We're still only +18. He went back, and Galatians 2:2 is one of the most incredible verses in the New Testament. I love the way the King James translates it here, but most translations say just about the same thing. Paul says in Galatians 2:2, I went back up after 14 years to see the other apostles and to set before them the gospel I was preaching, to see if I was running or had run in vain. What? Yeah, I went back up to Jerusalem to make sure we were all on the same page, to make sure we were all presenting the same gospel. Neat. So we do want to make sure that you guys were preaching the same thing. Galatians 2:2, I went back up there. I shared with them the gospel I was preaching. And then just a few verses later, Galatians 2:6, these 5 words in English, they added nothing to me. they added nothing to me. Then just 3 verses later, this is where we get the phrase, they laid hands on Barnabas and me, and they gave us the right hand of fellowship. And they said, y'all go to the Gentiles and take this message. We're going to stay here and give the message to the Jews. But the point is, the message was the same. They added nothing to me. You take it to them, we'll give it here, and that's what we decide to do. Paul says it this way in 1 Corinthians 15:11, reflecting on this is them telling Paul that he was okay. Here's Paul telling them that they're okay. 1 Corinthians 15:11, he just gives a list of the appearances, and then he says this, whether it is I or they, who are they? They are the other apostles, he says so in the context. Whether it is I or they, this is what we preach and this is what you believe. Paul's saying, hey, you don't like me? Great, go talk to Peter. Don't like Peter? Go talk to James. Because you're going to get the same message no matter who you talk to. Whether it's I or they, so we teach, and so you believe. Next few verses, that's why Paul says 3 times, if we're wrong about this, we're liars. If we're wrong about this, we're preaching in vain. The we're is he and the other apostles. Why? Because they were preaching the same message. Now, if if Peter and James gave it to Paul, they had it before he had it. Now, when I say an early creed, one of the reasons they know it's an early creed is because in the Greek, it reads stylistically. 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following reads like this in the Greek. Da 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 da. 2 stanzas with data, and not a rhyming sequence like American, like English, but with a way that's easily memorizable. Why? Because most New Testament scholars today believe that the vast majority of Jesus' audiences, contrary to other things you may have heard, the vast majority of Jesus' audiences were illiterate, up to 90%. What do you do when you teach somebody who's illiterate, but you want them to teach somebody else? What do? You tell stories that they'll remember. Parables. And you give them short, pithy statements that they will memorize. Turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, do unto others, that they will memorize. And when you codify things into a da 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 da, especially if there's an Aramaic original, which is the language Jesus speaks, now we know you're really going back in the church because somebody had to put this together. All right, Paul hears it. They had it before Paul. Someone had to codify it. You had to get it from the events to the da 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 da, and we're right on top of it. In fact, some of the leading scholars today have said the following. Larry Hurtado, just recently retired, head of the religion department at Edinburgh University. Hurtado says, coming out of the gates in 30 AD, Hurtado says 2 doctrines had to be present or there would be no Christianity. What are those 2 doctrines? Deity of Christ and a resurrection. Of course, if there's a resurrection, there's a death. So deity, death, resurrection. That's the gospel. Whenever you hear the gospel defined in the New Testament, writings of Paul or in the book of Acts, that's the minimal gospel presentation. Deity, death, resurrection, and then the question of, do you have faith? And that's what Paul's saying in 1 Corinthians 15:1 and 2. What did you do with that message? Did you believe? First 2 verses, 1 Corinthians 15:1 and 2. So deity, death, resurrection, belief. And Hurtado says, coming out of the gate, you got that. From Edinburgh. Okay. Richard Bauckham, Cambridge. Same thing. I gave this lecture one time at Cambridge, same lecture, and Richard Bauckham, who's a very prominent scholar, slipped in and was sitting in the back row while I was speaking. And I went ahead and gave him a regular lecture, which took his name in vain several times, and said, Richard Bauckham says you can date it there. He sat in the back. I asked him later, do you have any comments? He said, no, that's what I teach. That is present from 30 to 31 AD. Okay, third guy, James D.G. Dunn, is influential as any historical Jesus scholar today. Dunn says the latest this ... form could have been memorized. The latest it would have been put from event into form is 6 months after the cross. That's James D.G. Dunn. Here's the cross. 6 months later, this is in ... form. And like I said, the very latest is Bart Ehrman. I started the lecture with it. Bart Ehrman saying we can get this back to... He has other arguments. Bart Ehrman does. Now, to bring this full circle, make a comment or two and I'll be done. What about my professor who said, yeah, go ahead and do the resurrection, but don't say it happened because the New Testament said it happened. And I said, critical scholars use the New Testament, but they use it critically. They don't assume it's inspired or even reliable. They use it critically. How would Bart Ehrman, for Bart, how would Bart, qua Bart, get that conclusion of 1 to 2 years later? Well, one of the things he does in this book, Did Jesus Exist? He asks, how many independent arguments do we have for the crucifixion of Jesus? Now, the Jesus Seminar, a very critical, very quote-unquote liberal group, says if you have 2 sources for something, that makes the proclamation a lot greater chance of being historical, because 2 heads are better than 1. 2 sources are great. Bart Ehrman asked the question, how many sources do we have for the crucifixion? He gives a list. He cites, to his skeptical mind, the way he does this, he gives 11 sources, 11 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. 11. Now, on ancient historical grounds, why isn't 11 exemplary? When, as Paul Meyer says, professor of ancient history, Western Michigan University, Meyer says many things in the ancient world depend on 1 witness, and 2 make an event unimpeachable. 2. Bart Ehrman says we have 11 different sources, historical sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. So here's what you get, bottom line. This phrase will have virtually no disputants in the contemporary world. Jesus' earliest followers had experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. Virtually nobody disputes that. Bart Ehrman says, no, I don't dispute that. It's determined historically. We know it's true. Why would I say I dispute it? It's just true. So here's what you do. We have that sentence. The earliest followers of Jesus had experiences that they believe were appearances of the risen Jesus. And what do you do if you're a skeptic? You come up with alternatives. Well, maybe they were lying. Well, maybe they saw hallucinations. But the same data, which I've been given here, the same data which scholars share, say those other theories don't work. And so now you're left with an appearance. And therefore, a lot of skeptics, place we began, a lot of people today who are happy and are often quoted by the skeptical community will say, I'm a skeptic, as Dale Allison does. He was the one I was citing earlier. Dale Allison, who says, I'm a skeptic. He called himself a cryptic deist. And then he says, but I'm sure the risen Jesus appeared to his disciples after his death. I can give you others, but is that the definition? Ed Sanders, E.P. Sanders, Duke University, recently retired from Duke, historian. He gives a list of well-accepted historical events, and he calls himself a liberal. And then he says this in his list of accepted historical facts. He says, the following is an historical fact. The earliest disciples saw the risen Jesus. I don't know how exactly they saw him, but they saw him. That's his list, and that's part of his list. That's one of his facts in his irreducible minimum list. the earliest disciples saw the risen Jesus. How do we get that? Because we have the data that can track it back to the beginning.